In this video, I'm going to be talking about one of the biggest mistakes people make when portrait painting, and I'm going to be showing you what you need to do to avoid making it. To show you what this mistake is, we have our model Stefan lit with daylight from a north-facing window. As you can see, Stefan has a lot of interesting bone structure. So when we look at Stefan, we immediately focus on all these interesting small shapes. To demonstrate what happens when I focus on a small area of my subject, I've dropped Stefan into Photoshop. Now, I might notice this small halftone just under Stefan's right cheekbone. This halftone appears darker than the surrounding lights. But if I just compare this halftone with the light next to it, without comparing it to the other shadows, the difference in value is going to appear greater than it really is. So I will inevitably make it too dark. Or I might notice an area within a shadow that gets a little lighter, like this reflected light under the brow. Again, if I just compare this with the shadow right next to it and not the other light areas, I will exaggerate the difference in value and make it too light. If I then continue to exaggerate every subtle shift in value that I see, I'm going to end up with a patchwork of small light and dark shapes like you can see here, and I'll lose the larger relationships between the main areas of light and dark. This is one of the most common mistakes you see in work by inexperienced painters, which we refer to as overmodeling. To avoid overmodeling, we need to be able to see the whole before the parts, so we need to establish the larger value relationships before we start looking at small areas separately. And as it happens, there's a really useful tool in Photoshop that does this for you. First, I'm going to convert this image into grayscale. I'm then going to use the Median tool, which can be found in the menu bar under Filters, Noise, Median. This basically converts the image into average light and dark tonal values in a very similar way to squinting at your subject in real life. So I've essentially simplified Stefan into four main values. We have the shadows on the side plane of Stefan's head. We have the mouth area, which is also in shadow, and the side plane of Stefan's nose. Then we have the light area on the front plane of Stefan's head. We have some highlights on the forehead, and we have a darker value for the hair and the eyes. By establishing four main values at the start of the painting, I have them as a guide, so when I need to add more subtle shifts in value, like halftones in the lights, I can compare them with the shadows to make sure they don't become too dark. Now, if you're working from photos, the Median tool in Photoshop is a really useful tool to help you simplify the tonal values. But if you're working from life, you need to be able to do what the Median tool does in your head. So to show you what this looks like in practice, I'm going to be painting a portrait of Stefan in monochrome, using just ivory black and titanium white. You can see a full-length version of this demo filmed in real time over on my Patreon channel, as this is the first in a series of portraits I'll be doing for my Alla Prima portrait painting course. And the reason the first portrait on that course is in monochrome is because this idea of being able to recognise the main light and dark tonal values is so fundamental to Alla Prima painting. So here you can see I've placed the whole head on the canvas. I'm next going to place a horizontal centerline for the bottom of the eyes and a vertical centerline that runs through the bridge of the nose and the middle of the mouth. These centerlines indicate the position of the features, the eyes, nose and mouth. But notice how I'm not drawing the features themselves. Instead, I'm squinting down at my subject and I'm looking for the main shadow shapes. The whole eye sockets, the side plane of the head, the shadow under the nose, and the whole of the mouth area, simplifying the head into a series of larger shapes. Also notice how I'm not drawing any intricate outlines for these shadow shapes. I'm still only using straight lines. Once the shadow shapes have been mapped out, I'm next going to mix a dark grey colour, which I'm going to use to start massing them in with. I'm now using some ivory black to mass in the hair, the darkest value in my painting. And here I'm using some of my shadow colour to mass in the background just to the right of Stefan's head, as when I squint I see this as being very similar in value to the shadows. With the darker areas massed in, I'm now mixing a lighter grey colour for the lights, which I'll use to mass in the light side of Stefan's head. Here you can see I'm using some of the shadow mixture to adjust the right side of Stefan's face. So I'm using these two value colours to draw with, adjusting and correcting the light and dark shapes until I have a kind of flat posterization that looks like Stefan. This is like seeing someone you know in the distance. You can recognise them from 100 metres away, long before you can see any details. Then, once I have the shadows and the lights massed in, I'm going to mix a middle value in between the shadows and the lights. I'm going to place this middle value along the edges of the shadows, and do you see how this rounds the form in between the shadows and the lights, making my 2D posterization appear more 3D. I'm now mixing my fifth and lightest value. Which I'm going to use to place the highlights on Stefan's forehead. So I now have 5 main values established, ranging from dark to light. The darkest value for the hair and dark accents, the shadows, a mid-tone in between the shadows and the lights, a value for the main light areas, and finally the highlights. With these 5 values placed on the canvas, I have something that looks like the image I created earlier in Photoshop using the median tool, which is recognisable as Stefan and also has a greater sense of volume or 3D. This is the blocking stage of the painting complete. I'm now ready to start adding the more subtle shifts in value in between my main values to refine Stefan's head further. Here I'm using some of the mid-tone to place the small reflected light just under Stefan's left eyebrow. But that's way too light. So here I'm mixing a more subtle value that's in between the mid-tone and the shadow, which I'll use to make this reflected light a little darker. So as I add smaller shapes with more subtle shifts in value, I can compare them with the main values I've already established to make sure I don't over-exaggerate them. I can compare the small parts against the whole so that I don't overmodel. Now, when I'm working in colour, I don't start with a monochrome painting. I start by mixing just one colour for each of the main values, a colour for the shadows, a colour for the lights, and so on. but I don't try to match the colours that I see exactly. For the blocking stage, even though I'm working in colour, I'm only thinking about getting the value right. Then, once I've completed the blocking stage and I'm working on the refining stages, I'll start to think about colour more carefully, and I'll add variations of colour within each of the main values. But as I add variations in colour, I once again need to be really careful not to over-exaggerate the difference in value between them, as a mistake we often make is to interpret changes in colour as changes in value. This is another reason why it's so important to establish the larger value relationships at the start. But it's all very well just saying how you need to simplify your subject into 3 or 4 main value shapes. Learning to recognise the main values is actually one of the most difficult things we have to do when painting. In our everyday lives, we don't need to see the whole before the parts. We need to see the item we're looking for on a supermarket shelf or the number of a bus we're waiting for. So our brains have been programmed to focus on detail. Learning to simplify the world into simple light and dark shapes goes against our nature and requires a great deal of effort and practice. Here I'm mixing a darker value that's in between the shadow and the ivory black, which, after completing the refining stages of the painting, I'm going to use to start placing the small details. You often hear artists say how important it is to simplify your subjects, but in most of the painting demos I've seen, amazing though they may be, other than telling you to squint, most of them never really explain how recognising the larger value shapes is the way you actually go about it. I know this is only a short demo, but hopefully this gives you a slightly better idea of what's involved. When I'm critiquing my students' work online, I often use the median tool in Photoshop to show them how to simplify the values in their work. So I thought I'd share it with you guys in case it gives you a better idea of what simplifying your subject into 4 or 5 main values looks like. It's also really useful when you're working from reference photos. Here, I'm using some of the light value to place the highlights in the eyes. Notice how the highlights in the eyes aren't as light as the main highlight on the forehead. If you want to learn more about simplifying tonal values, I've made a whole course over on my Patreon channel that focuses on this subject alone, with over 10 hours of video and specially designed exercises, my Introduction to Mass Drawing course. You'll also find my Essentials of Colour course and now part 1 of my Alla Prima portrait painting course. Finally, I'm using some of the highlight value to mass in Stefan's white t-shirt. So there we have yet another video on simplifying tonal values to start off 2022. But then that is the name of this channel. So I hope you found this helpful and that it's given you an idea of what you need to do to avoid overmodeling in future. I'd just like to end by saying a massive thank you for all your support in 2021. I wish you all a very happy new year and a productive year of painting in 2022. Until next time, thank you for watching.